Hi, welcome everyone. First of all, I'm so sorry for canceling class. If you checked your announcements, you'll see that it snowed like crazy here in Lubbock. I'm sure it snowed where you are. So, in the spirit of trying to keep that open day before the exam so that you guys can have some more time to study, I'm going to pop this one up online. The slides are already online as well so that you can follow along. So we'll just dive right in. Um, this chapter is going to be about voting. We're going to kind of focus on a lot of sort of how the American electorate looks when it comes to voting and voting turnout and sort of racial and gender differences or comparisons, sort of international comparisons, etc. So, excuse me. We'll just dive right into slide one. All right, so the basics. In the United States, basically the election, what would you even call it? Controversy, I guess, in the recent decade or so. You have both parties taking a different stand on elections, right? So Democrats want to be as inclusive as possible. They want to bolster voter turnout. Um, they try to do everything they can to try and increase turnout, including same day registration and automatic registration, things like allowing felons to vote. A couple of northeastern states, like Vermont and New Hampshire, I believe, are the two states that allow actual prisoners to vote while they're still in prison. Their Supreme Court in the states basically said they're still citizens and therefore they deserve the right to vote. Some other states, Florida would be a good example, gives felons their right to vote back after they've served their time and after they've paid their court fees. So there are different ways of allowing felons to sort of re-enter suffrage, basically. Um, you also have for the Democrats, you have a lot of early voting and even sort of mail in voting and drive up voting. We saw a lot of that during the COVID era. And then they tend to be, Democrats tend to be more urban focused and minority focused, right? Because these are the sort of demographics that tend to support Democrats. And so on the other side, you have the Republicans who are sort of screaming about voter integrity, right? And that we need to protect the vote as much as possible, and that there's a lot of sort of voter fraud, which is, just patently untrue. There's not a lot of voter fraud in the U.S. system. The Trump case in 2020, where Trump claimed that there was all this, outright voter fraud across the United States. More than 60 court cases went before the courts and the appeals courts and the Supreme Court, and Trump lost all 60 of them. There is no massive voter fraud, but that is sort of the position that the Republicans have taken. They want to try to reduce voting time, right? They're trying to roll back early voting and sort of this, you know, drive up voting and things like that. They introduced voting laws, which Democrats suggest are sort of racist because it's young people and it's minorities and sort of like the homeless and the displaced who are less likely to be able to get a voter ID or any sort of identification card. Um, Republicans tend to be more rural and tend to be supported by sort of white Protestants in general. And again, there's almost no evidence for voter fraud. There are a random few cases here and there, but there's certainly not any sort of rampant voter fraud or some giant conspiracy to stuff the ballots. That it just doesn't exist. There's no evidence for it. All right, so we're going to move on to slide two. This is a sort of racial breakdown of how the United States votes. This is the 2016 vote between Trump and Hillary Clinton. And so you can see in the top line, the first thing I'd like you to notice is the sort of the absence of third party votes, right? No group voted more than 7% for a third party group, right? And so it's very, very rare to see a third party have any sort of inroads in the United States. There's really only two presidential candidates who ever made it as a third party candidate, made any sort of inroad. One was in the 1990s under Ross Perot. He sort of was in the Bush/Clinton 1992 election. And then there's, man, I cannot remember his name, but there's a really racist segregationist who ran in the 1960s. And he actually garnered a lot of the South vote, right? He's the only third-party candidate ever to win U.S. delegates. You know what? I'll look up his name real quick because it's pretty interesting. Oops. Give me 2 seconds. I'm sorry about that. George Wallace is his name. I'm sorry about the pause, but George Wallace was a segregationist, sort of racist Southerner who was sort of fed up with the civil rights movement, and so he ran, and he actually garnered some delegates, won some states in the South. So he and Ross Perot are basically the only two third-party candidates. But back to it. So, other than the fact that the electorate basically doesn't give third parties a chance, third parties don't have a chance in the United States system, you can see some major discrepancies between the racial groups in the United States, right? White Americans tend to vote Republican. It looks like about 60% of white Americans. We'll see later there are gender discrepancies, right? Most of these are white men. You can see that black Americans vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party. 90% or more generally tend to not show up, but at least 90% of those who do show up tend to vote for the Democratic Party. Hispanics tend to lean Democratic, right? Because the Catholic Party has long been sort of associated with the Democratic Party in the United States, back all the way through Kennedy. We are seeing this change a little bit. There have been some movement in Hispanic candidates, especially in sort of the border states like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. We have seen a shift, at least in part, more toward the Republican Party than the Democrats. But generally, the Hispanics tend to be a strong sort of Democratic stronghold. Hispanics tend to be the lowest voting group in the United States. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, there's a lot of fear in the Hispanic community, right? Because there's a lot of illegal aliens, and there's worry that if you sort of have contacts with the government, there will be fear that you'll be looked into, right? There's also the fact that Hispanics tend to be very, very young. The Hispanic sort of average right now, I think, is around 24 years old in the United States, whereas like white Americans tend to average at like 42 to 44 years old. And so you're much more likely to vote the older you get, as we'll see shortly. And so that's sort of a detriment to the Spanish vote. All right, so we'll move on from there. All right, I think this is slide 3. So this is voting in comparative perspective. The United States is a weird country because we have more elections than any other country on the planet. We have elections for all kinds of stuff, right? Not just the president and the House and the Senate and the governor and the lieutenant governor and the secretary of state and, your local mayor and your local city council and sometimes it's your sheriff and like your lead dog catcher in your community. And I mean, there are a plethora of elections that happen in the United States. It's kind of insane how many we have, at least compared to other countries. But the problem here is that our voter turnout is relatively miserable, right, compared to the rest of at least advanced democracies in the rest of the world. And so you can see here, Belgium is voting at 87%. They top the voting turnout. And then the United States is almost nearly at the bottom with just over 50%. And this is just for a presidential election, right? And so we see, at least a 10 to 15% drop off in a gubernatorial election. And then we see another 20-point drop off when it comes to like local and municipal elections. And so, yeah, our voter turnout is very, very low. And, we would have had a discussion here about why, but we'll move on to the next slide. And there are a lot of reasons why voter turnout is very low. One is that most states don't do automatic registration, right? You have to register generally through sort of the Department of Motor Vehicles, but you can also register, with the parties oftentimes. But a lot of states don't do auto registration. And I know in Texas, like if you're not registered like 30 to 45 days before the election, you can't vote. And so this makes it difficult for, people who are moving or students especially, or people who are sort of displaced. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult. And just people who aren't really attentive, right? Who aren't that into politics. It disincentivizes them because now they have to pay a cost, to go through some rigmarole to get registered to vote, right? Another problem is voter ID laws. A lot of research shows that voter ID laws tend to reduce the vote, especially against poor and minority voters. We don't have mandatory voting laws, so some countries basically mandate that you vote. And if you don't, you pay, a small fee, like $20 to $50 or something. And some people don't vote, and a lot of times they don't actually enforce the fine. But it's supposed to like show your country that voting is, I don't know, socially important, right? Politically important. That the right of the people to voice their opinion is important. But we don't have that in the United States. So that would be a country like Australia, which has mandatory voting and very, very high turnout. We don't have competitive districts in the United States, right? So, like 90 to 95% of all districts in the United States are safe seats. They're not within 10 points of being challenged in a general election. And this is because of gerrymandering, right? The United States Supreme Court has basically said that you can gerrymander in politically manipulative ways, as long as it's not as long as it's not sort of racially gerrymandered. If you just stuff a whole bunch of liberals into one district and then, create 6 surrounding Republican districts, that is allowed, according to the United States Supreme Court. And so we've seen gerrymandering just get out of control across red and blue states. New York is very, very gerrymandered. Texas is widely considered to be the most gerrymandered state in the United States. So we have very, very few competitive elections, and through research we know that if the election is not competitive, people just aren't going to show up, right? There's no incentive for you to show up and express your opinion if, like in Texas, the Republican is guaranteed his seat. And so because there's so many of those districts across the United States, it also drives turnout down. We don't have a federal holiday, and our election is held on a Tuesday, weirdly. It is the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, right? That's a really weird rule, but that's the way it goes. The first Tuesday after the first Monday in November is at least the big election, and it's not a federal holiday. Whereas most countries have sort of a weekend election, and or if they have an election during the week, they'll generally hold it on a Friday, and they'll hold a federal holiday where everyone gets the day off. But we don't do that in the United States either. Another problem is sort of the decline of unions. Union members tend to be very avid voters. They tend to turn out at really high rates because their union is constantly feeding them information about the elections and encouraging them to go vote. And we see that the higher the union membership in a country, the higher the voting turnout tends to be. And so the United States has seen a precipitous decline in union membership since the 1960s, basically, and especially since sort of the 80s, when Reagan and the Republicans took up this sort of anti-union stance. And so union membership might be, I think right now it's around 10% of the eligible population, working population, is a union member. And union growth is occurring, and support for unions is at its highest that it's been in maybe 100 years. And so there has been a little bit of a turn. But we are also finding that non-union jobs are outpacing union jobs. And so while interest is high in unions and membership is increasing, union roles as a percentage of the working population is actually in decline still. And so that is tamping down election turnout. There's a lot of dissatisfaction and distrust, right? There's a lot of skepticism about the United States government on both sides of the political aisle, right? Progressives are very skeptical of the United States government. They think it's sort of racist and institutionally racist. The Republicans are very skeptical of the United States government. They think that, the federal government should have less power. There are a lot of libertarians out there who suggest that basically the federal government should all but not exist, and that it should just be in charge of, say, military and national disasters, things of that sort. And so distrust in the U.S. government has grown just precipitously, especially since sort of the 1960s and 70s. It really started with Nixon, right? Nixon and the Watergate scandal, where he broke into the Watergate Hotel to steal documents from the Democratic National Committee. And then was caught, and he was going to be impeached, and he left office instead. And his vice president was also impeached, Agnew. And so it was just a very bad time for government. And then Jimmy Carter took over, and we had stagflation, and we had the oil crisis, and the 1970s were just disastrous for sort of trust in government, and it has been in decline ever since. And it's in decline for all of our institutions, right? Not just our legislature, which has incredibly low approval ratings. Our presidents have had really low approval ratings in the last decade or so. Our Supreme Court has some of the lowest approval ratings we've ever seen in history. Usually the Supreme Court is sort of, seen as outside the realm of politics and sort of above it all, but the Supreme Court has been mired in politics in recent years, and people are very worried about it, and so this distrust also leads to people feeling like, what's the point of me voting, and they don't show up. We also have seen a real decline in civic engagement, right? Civic education. You don't really get taught civics in high school or middle school anymore. Thank goodness, you have to take some politics classes in college to learn the basics of the United States government and federalism and separation of powers, and sort of why all of these political systems are important and how they're different from the rest of the world. But we know civics is in decline, media knowledge is in decline, newspaper readership is in decline. So all of these things also lead to a drop in voter turnout. And then poverty rates. We know that the more affluent tend to be the ones who vote, and so the more poverty you have, the less you tend to vote. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. This is party identification over time. And so what's important here is that party ID is basically in decline while the declaration of being an independent is rising, right? So parties are sort of taking a back seat in a sense. People are much less likely to be sort of affiliated with or registered with a political party today than they used to be. Um, Parties are sort of doing less, right? Parties used to do a lot for their communities. Um, they do a lot less these days. It's a lot more about the individual candidate than it is about the political party anymore. And so political party affiliation is dropping. You can see here, especially sort of amongst the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party. And this just means that moderates and independents are taking up a larger and larger proportion of our voting electorate, making it more and more difficult to predict elections. All right, we'll move on to the next one. State elections. So we should just know sort of some of the basics of the processes involved and who's involved in sort of running elections, right? And so the Secretary of State runs elections in the vast majority of the U.S. states. I don't know who the Secretary of State in Texas is. Not a lot of people do, I'm guessing. So it's their job to set the election dates, the ones that are at least not sort of federally set, that, first Tuesday after the first Monday thing. They have to set the dates for the elections. They have to qualify the candidates. They have to make sure that, they meet all of the qualifications for candidacy. That includes, how old are you? Are you registered with a political party? Um, let's see. Do you live in your district? There's a really interesting case in the Dallas area right now where someone running for the state house, he registered his home as his business where he's running for election in that county, but he doesn't actually live there. And so his challengers in the primary have taken him to court, suggesting that he doesn't actually qualify to be a candidate. I think it's in the Denton area. Um, and so he's arguing that, yes, I can still register my business as my sort of home address. I don't actually have to live there. I own property in the county. So it'll be interesting to see what the courts say. It looks like, from whatever I'm hearing, at least from sort of the Texas Tribune and the Texas Standard, that it looks like the courts are leaning toward just letting him run anyway. And allowing him to claim his business as his sort of his address. So, we haven't seen a ruling yet, but I've been keeping an eye on it. The Secretary of State also has to print and count ballots, right? So um, they distribute the ballots and then they count them at the end, or at least they have volunteers count them, and then the head of each volunteer district will send the numbers to the Secretary of State, whose office will compile them and tell you who won which elections, etc. The municipalities are involved a little bit in that they draw up the voter districts, right? So where you go to vote, like your local school or your grocery store or whatever it is drawn up by the municipalities themselves. Okay, the evolution of suffrage is the next slide. So we got a lot here. First of all, we'll look at the graph, right? You can see, obviously, that voter turnout was incredibly low, at least early in our the advent of the country, right, in the 1780s. Incredibly low. A couple of reasons for this. One, it's rural. It's a new electoral system. There wasn't a lot of information out there. It's also that a lot of people just couldn't vote, right? Women can't vote, black people can't vote, Hispanics can't vote, Irish and Polish can't vote. You had to be sort of a white land-owning man, and it wasn't just land owning. You had to have in most states you had to have a home or a homestead or something built upon that land, to a minimal specifications. It couldn't just be some shanty. And so, it's very difficult to be sort of a registered voter, at least in the founding, right? Eventually, the landowning requirements begin to sort of fall apart. There's frustration and sort of revolt at the bottom from the people, from the at least the white men who are still having to pay taxes and things of that sort, who are frustrated that they're having to pay taxes but don't have the right to vote, right? So, why did we fight this revolution? This is the exact same problem. So a lot of those sort of started to fall off the colonial charters, right? And more white men, at least, were allowed the enfranchisement. Then we fight the Civil War. The 15th Amendment is passed post-Civil War. It's around 1868, I believe. And this is supposed to give minorities the right to vote. It basically says you can't discriminate against minorities or former slaves when it comes to voting. But the federal government basically didn't enforce the rules, and so you get the era of Jim Crow, right? Of separation, of apartheid in the United States, basically, separate but equal rulings. You get the Jim Crow laws, like literacy tests, that a lot of white people didn't have to take. They were exempted. But if you were black or if you were a minority, you would have to pass this sort of exorbitant literacy test about your state constitution and the sort of intricate laws of your state. They had poll taxes where you'd have to actually pay to be able to vote. The Supreme Court got rid of poll taxes in the mid 1960s under the 25th Amendment. You have sort of intimidation and even lynchings, right? Where groups like the KKK and others would just basically ensure that no black people could get to their voting district. Things start to change in the 1900s. You have the suffrage movement in the early 1900s, and women, the U.S. legislature passes the 19th Amendment in 1919, and then the states ratify it in 1920. And so in 1920, women get the vote. Then you have in the 1960s, again, we talked about it a little bit, but Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Baines Johnson comes into office, LBJ, and he signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act basically says that every citizen gets an equal vote. You cannot discriminate against black voters. And you cannot gerrymander based on race, which the Supreme Court has sort of tinkered with in recent years and sort of ravaged that law in recent years, but at least that was the intention. And so that's sort of the first time that these literacy tests and poll taxes and et cetera get wiped off the board. The National Guards in some cases are called up to help enforce black voting rights. And then in the 1970s, you get this drop from the voting minimum age of 21 to 18, right? And that happens with the 26th Amendment in 1971. This was yet another reason why our voting turnout is so low. Again, the more we research voting, the more we learn that the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. And so in 1971, when we dropped the age to 18, it just introduced a whole lot of non-voters, basically. And so, yes, some of them vote, but in general, the youth vote is very low. And so it depressed our numbers even further. Okay, let's move on. Oh, one other point here on this slide, on the graph. It is interesting to point out um, midterm elections tended to be higher than federal elections, at least really early in our nation. For about the first 60 to 80 years, midterms, people thought that their governorships and their local electors were more powerful, and in a sense they were. The federal government started eking out more and more power, especially after sort of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, and the wiping away of habeas corpus, and then especially in the 1930s with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, taking powers for the Great Depression and World War II. But really early in our existence as a country, the people saw, and they were probably right, that state and local elections were more important, which tend to be the midterm elections. Um, and then that really changes sort of right before the Civil War, and it's never ever gone back since, right? And we tend to have about 10 to 15 point higher turnout in presidential elections than we do in midterm elections. So that's important to know. All right, we'll move on. All right, this is voter turnout by state. This is the 2016 election again. So you can see sort of the northern band of the United States tends to have much higher turnout. This is in part sort of tied to Elazar's arguments that we touched on in the very first lecture. And then you tend to get much lower turnout, especially in the South, right? And we also know that the more poverty you have, the more minorities you have in your state, the lower your turnout's going to be. And so we sort of see these influences across the United States. Texas has really, really low turnout, right? At 50%, basically. We're one of the worst in the United States. All right, moving on. This is just turnout presidential versus the midterm. Again, know that it's about 10 to 15%. Quite often, there's a massive jump in presidential elections where a lot of people turn out. Right. All right, we'll move on to the next one. So this is turnout by age and race. I told you we'd talk a little bit about this. So if you look at the graph on the left, you can see that those who are over 65 tend to vote at the highest rates, and then it just falls from there, right? 45 to 65 vote a little less, 30 to 45 vote a little less, and 18 to 29 vote at the worst rates, right? And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that the younger you are, sort of the less you know about politics, right? The less you know sort of which camp you're in, or which party sort of symbolizes which party platforms and which ideologies and which what kind of policies do they want to implement. So knowledge about that stuff is low when you're young. You also don't really have a whole lot vested, right? You don't own a home. You're probably not married yet. You probably don't have kids yet. You probably haven't really started your career yet. Maybe your first job or two, but you don't really know where you're at. And so, that will reduce voting. The fact that you're probably jumping from house to house, right? Moving from apartments, or you're in a college dorm, or you're at mom's house in the summer, or you're here and there, that also reduces voting dramatically, right? And so all of these things sort of reduce your likelihood of vote as you're younger. And then as you build those things, the older you get, the more likely you are to show up. We can also see on the rightmost graph sort of your propensity to vote by race. And so white people tend to be the most likely to show up. Whites tend to have higher levels of education. They tend to have higher levels of socioeconomic development, right? They have more money, more savings. They're more likely to have a vehicle to be able to get to the polls. Black citizens tend to be the second most likely to show up. They're very strong Democratic voters. They tend to show up at pretty high rates. And then Hispanics and Asians tend to be sort of at the bottom of the list. As we talked about earlier, Hispanics have a lot of really young. They tend to trend very young, right? And so they're going to be much less likely to vote. It'll be interesting to see as more and more, as the book pointed out, about 50,000 Hispanic voters become eligible to vote every month. And so it'll be interesting to see as they start to enter the voting force, sort of how it all pans out, right? All right. Voting and gender is the next slide. So you can see here that women who are the dark brown line tend to vote at a higher rate than men at every single age level except the very elderly, right? Except when you're over 65. And I'm not really sure why that exception exists, honestly. But women do tend to vote more often by about 2 to 3 points than men do. And it's called the gender gap, right? And we see this across basically all elections. Women have been very strong voters, at least all the way back to the 1970s. All right, next slide. This one is voting and gender number 2. And this shows that women tend to be much more democratic than men. So what they did here is they took the number of women who said that they're Democratic, and then they subtracted the number of women who said that they're Republican, and that's the line. And then the light green line is men, right? And so the closer you get to 0, that means we're sort of evened out, right? We're half men, half women. And then as you drop below the 0 line, that means you're more Republican than not, right? And so the dark green line above the 0 shows this massive gap of women who tend to claim, or at least lean, Democratic rather than Republican. And there's a lot of reasons for this, right? The Democratic Party tends to be more sort of family focused, focused on the sort of things like child welfare, but also on women's rights, like abortion rights, which have been extremely important in the last couple of years since the Dobbs decision in 2022, when a lot of these states basically said we will not allow abortions under any exceptions, even if it's medical or rape or incest, unfortunately. So a lot of women, and we saw in the 2022 elections and some special elections in 2023 that, at least when it comes to the abortion issue, Americans tend to be overwhelmingly in support of allowing abortion access. So the Ohio vote in 2023 and some others were very indicative that people are not only turning out at high rates because they're very concerned about this issue, but also sort of very supportive of at least basic abortion rights. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. Oh, that's it. Okay, that's the lecture for today. Like I said, I'm so sorry I had to miss today, but I will see you all on Wednesday. I hope you have a wonderful week. Congratulations to the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes from Texas Tech, whoop, for winning the Super Bowl. And I'll see you all on Wednesday. Have a great day.